Okay, when I start teaching modeling in Revit, I actually kind of like to start with the most difficult elements. So in this next Revit tutorial, I'm actually going to start not with sort of the basic building components, but actually with the more complicated building components that you can begin to create in Revit. And the reason for doing that is when you first are learning Revit, you don't want to treat the program as something that's going to drive you to thinking about this basic kind of configuration of walls is what I'm limited to in designing. Software programs can pull your design quality down to what you know in the software. And that's a big mess. You don't want the software to be driving your design. You actually want your creativity, your imagination, what the project should be about. Those are elements that should be driving the design, not the software. So, as you're creating basic elements, um, those things are all good and well, but what we typically see in architecture school is, yeah, I have walls, but they don't even really run vertically. They're doing something weird and funky, and if they're not doing something weird and funky, I would rather them being doing something weird and funky than just these sort of straight up and down boring things. So, the reality is you'll use this core set of tools and the curtain wall tools and the basic creative tools, the roof tool, floor tool, you'll use those very often, but they're all really easy to manage, they're easy to work through. The tools that I actually like to start teaching first are the component tools. How do we start creating custom shapes and things inside of the program so that we can really design whatever our imagination desires? So let's just launch that tool set here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on component. And we're going to start with this idea of model in place. So when I launch components are really about a couple of things. They're sort of considered pre-built objects inside of Revit. So if you notice, the default component is a desk. It comes up in my properties list, and I can just start placing that desk around. If I look at that in 3D, you'll see little 3D desks all around. If I select it, I can get the desk's properties, where it's located. I can usually get in there a little bit further and say edit type, and I can change its size. Like if I want it to be 20 feet deep, it'll actually change all of the desks that I've placed that are in that type. But what I really want to do is not just sort of place things with the component tool. So if I go component, I've got a list of default objects. I can load in additional objects. What I really want to use the component tool for is to begin making custom models. So let's start off, well, let's edit this back from 20 to, I believe it was 2 feet or something like that. Let's get into making some custom models. Component, rather than load family or rather than just starting with a simple desk, I'm going to click model in place. Now I get this family, category, and parameters panel that pops up. And I'm only going to walk through two of the types. As you get more advanced in Revit, you will find yourself really building custom objects based on these different categories. When you're learning Revit, I suggest only using two of these categories because they're going to allow you to work, or the program to work, in its most predictable fashion. When you're learning Revit, you're probably not building schedules. You're probably wanting everything to show up in every view, to these items not be view dependent. So what I really want to start with is just this idea of a generic model. It's going to be a simple class of model. It shows up in every view. It's something that you could edit later to start showing up in schedules. But again, at the learning level of Revit where you're starting out, typically you're not even concerned about that at this point. So I'm just going to select generic models and say OK. I'm going to name it, just call it walls. And if you'll notice, everything has actually been grayed out now in the background. I can't even select the walls or anything that's there. Now, this is important to sort of begin understanding the level of editing that we do in Revit. There are several scales or modes of editing. So if I want to start creating my custom component, I'm going to go to Create, and there are a series of custom component types: the extrusion, blend, revolve, sweep, and swept blend, as well as void forms. So let's just start with an extrusion. So right now, we were editing our component object, and right now I'm going to edit the actual base of a component object. So I'm just going to draw a square outside of this, and then I'm going to click the Finish Edit mode, and I actually have a 3D object. If I look at its properties, it is 1 foot tall, and I know its dimensions. Its side-to-side dimensions are essentially the length and the width as defined by the square that I originally drew. So we're editing at the component level right now. So I can tell that by the original base model is still grayed out. This is heavier black lines. If I select this object and say edit extrusion, I'm back down to these purple lines again, and I can actually come in and edit those and set specific lengths and widths, and then I can finish my editing. I'm back to the component level. I can edit a little bit more the overall object. Let's say if we wanted to make that a 10-foot tall box, I can say finish model, and I'm back to the overall base model. So you can see I've got my component object, I've got my walls. Now I shouldn't say every object, but most objects in Revit have that kind of level of modeling. For instance, if I select a wall, I can say edit profile, and that wall, just like this component object, was taken back down to that sort of base point of extrusion. I can come in and edit what that baseline is. Say finish, and that's going to change the shape of that wall. So most objects kind of work. They have that level of editing detail. So again, if I want to edit this component, I can select the component, edit in place, and now I'm at the component level editing mode. I can select my actual component object, edit extrusion, and I'm all the way back down to the base object. If I make a modification to the base, I can go all the way back up to my model with that edit in place. So everything stays flexible, everything stays editable. So let's go back in and look at some different component types. So again, I'm going to say edit in place, and so I'm no longer editing these walls, the parts of the project that were here. I'm in this component level editing mode. I want to go to create, and this time let's create a blend. So a blend uses two different pieces, top and bottom. So I'm going to start by doing, let's look at this in a plan view, level 1. I'm going to do a basic rectangle on the bottom. And now I'm going to say edit top. And I'm going to do another rectangle, except this time I'm going to do a lasso around everything. I'm going to rotate it. And then I'm going to say finish edit mode. If I look at that in 3D, I've built an object with a twist, but it's only 1 foot tall. So I'm going to grab this top grip and pull it up so you can actually see that twist a little bit. So that's what a blend does. Now a revolve actually builds something that's kind of like a spindle. So let's see if I can't do something like that really quickly. I'm going to go back to level 1, and I'm going to start by drawing an axis line. So that's what my object is going to rotate around, and now I'm going to build the boundary line. So I'm going to come away from my axis line and then out. I can change my line type to a spline, although these objects can become really intense in terms of their size, so sort of be careful what you're building. I'm going to come back to my base. I'm going to finish the edit. Oh, okay, so here's a problem that you're going to see often as you're building custom components. Lines must be in closed loops. What that's referring to is if I'm going to extrude something as a generic component, it needs to be a complete object. So I've got these two orange dots saying I have not completed the entirety of my object. So I'm going to say continue, and I'm going to close off. I'm going to add one more line in to complete this object. And now this piece of geometry is a closed loop. And now when I finish that off, I get this sort of weird looking chess piece kind of thing. If I can highlight it here. Okay, so again, I can take that piece, edit the revolve, and I can actually edit this baseline to do something as well. So I'm going to use a split. I'm going to use a trim. I'm going to finish my object, and now it actually is hollow in the middle. I can't really see anything from that, so I'm going to edit the revolve one more time to do something like that. Now, again, I've got to delete this extra line if I try and finish it. I should say lines can't intersect each other. It's a little bit of a mess right here. Again, I'm going to click continue, trim that, delete that. It should work. I know you can actually see that as a hollowed out object. Okay, so let's go to the next type, which is the sweep. Again, I'm going to go back to my plan view. So the sweep allows me to create a path. It places a reference plane, and we'll talk a little bit about reference planes here in just a minute. It places a reference plane along that path. And so what I can do now is I can draw something on that reference plane, and it's going to sweep it along the path. So I'm going to click the green check, finish edit, to finish my path. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say edit profile. So the profile is what's going to sweep along the path. So I'm going to say edit profile, and it's going to tell me, well, I really need to see something other than a plan view. If I hit cancel, I really can't draw something in this plan view. The reference plane is running along the path. So if I click edit profile, let's go to a 3D view. I'm going to say open view, and I can orient myself more to the direction of this piece. So I'm just going to start with a basic box and say finish and finish, and you can see it's taken that box and swept it along my path. So let's click edit sweep, and I'm going to select my object, and let's go to edit profile again, and let's look at making that a little bit more interesting. So other than just looking at it in this 3D view, I can pull up a specific view of this reference plane by clicking on viewer. So that brings up a little side box right here, and now I have a perfect sort of square on elevation of that reference plane. So this view is oriented to this reference plane. And I can add something in, like, let's do half of this. I'm going to split my circle, trim my edges, and then bevel off this piece. Finish, finish, close this reference view, and now I have a different shape swept along my path. Create, so the swept blend is pretty much the same as this, except rather than one reference plane, I actually have two, one at the beginning and one at the end. So let's go back to our level 1 plan view, swept blend, sketch the path, and so this time you can see that I have a reference plane at the beginning and end of the line, and that allows me to create two different profiles. So I'm going to click finish edit mode, and now I can do select profile 1 and edit profile, 3D view, and let's go ahead and open the viewer up, and I'm going to draw a box, finish, select profile 2, edit profile, viewer, and this time we'll draw a circle. Finish, so it's going to connect the square to the circle along the path. Now this is the tool that I most often see students break because they do something too extreme along a path and Revit can't resolve it. But the basics will work quite well, and it can be a pretty handy tool at times for building particularly complex things. So you can start to imagine how you use these items, these elements, to build up very, very complex shapes inside of Revit. So I'm going to go ahead and say Finish Model. And the next thing that I'm going to look at is one more level up in advance in terms of freeform shapes. So I'm going to start a brand new component this time. So I can have as many components as I need to in my scene. So if you notice, all of those objects are selected together. They're going to move as a group because that is one component. Once I select it and say Edit in Place, that's how I begin to edit the individual components. So I'm going to start a brand new component, Architecture, Component, Model in Place. And this is the other type of component or the other category and parameter to use when you need something even more complex than the groups that we just made, and that is the massing category. So I'm going to click OK, and I'll just leave that as Mass 1. So the massing toolset is a completely different kind of modeling tool than the initial categories, the 5 categories that we had here. So for instance, I can start just with a line. And I don't even need to make a closed looped object. I can just say I want that line to become an object. So it's actually begin to sweep that two-dimensional line vertically. Then I can begin to select different parts of my object and edit how they're configured. So that was selecting a line. I can select a node and actually begin to warp that wall or that surface. So this tool set behaves much more like the modeling set to create masses that we had in Visari. So I can make some very, very complex objects with this tool set, with this basic tool set. By the same token, I can come in and make more traditional closed forms. And I can create that entire loop, create form, so I actually have a solid object that I've pulled up. I can begin selecting points on that object to create edits. I can select lines on the object to modify the shape. I can even select a surface and rotate that surface in its axis. So I can build up really, really complex shapes doing that. I can also get really carried away and ultimately end up with things like blobs without a lot of design intent. So as soon as I click Finish on the massing component, I get a little warning sign that basically says your masses are not going to show up as a typical object. Because as soon as I create a mass, I actually need to turn it into a Revit object. And you do that by coming into Architecture. And let's say that I know that this is going to be a set of walls. Let's say an 8-inch thick wall. I'm going to come into my wall drop-down, Wall by Face. I've got an 8-inch wall selected. I'm just going to say I want this, 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 and this to actually be a wall, and for that wall to actually have thickness to it. And that's going to build that wall type over the top of that massing object. And again, I can use the Tab key. I should be able to select that original mass, and I could delete that, but I actually want to do one other item over here, because by the same token that I use just the standard wall tool, I can begin to come in and use the Curtain System tool and select a face. So that's not a simple face at all. That's actually a warping face that comes across. And I can say again, I'm not going to get into editing this tool just yet. It's just conceptually how this mass begins to become architectural objects. I'm going to select that, create system. You can see it's actually built a set of glazing objects inside of that parameter. So now if I delete my massing object, I'm left with actual Revit objects that begin to behave like Revit objects and are editable like Revit objects are. So that's the basic introduction of using components as modeling tools. That's really where I like to begin teaching modeling in Revit, because if you can start to master these complicated objects first, the again, you're limited not by the software, and you're not going to find yourself designing buildings inside of Revit that look like Revit buildings. You're actually going to design based on your imagination, without really thinking about the limits of how the software is going to perform and function.